Hey everybody, this time Matchmaker has a rather interesting idea of what I am equivalent to, throwing me up against tier 10 heavies, not tier 7 heavies, and giving me only TDs for my own tier 10s. I am of course in a medium, the 4202. I shouldn't complain though, because historically I've done quite well on this map in the 4202. Some of my best matches in this tank, in fact, have been on this map. So right away, I have a pretty strong idea of what I'm going to do. I typically play the middle in my mediums now. I used to go around the sort of E3, E4 area, around that central rock. I don't really do it anymore, partly because it's just as exposed to arty as the middle is, and also because it just isn't a very useful position. A lot of the time you get stuck behind the rock and you can't push out either side because the enemy have you locked down. Much better position, also as you cross to get to that rock, you won't have shots on people very easily. A much more useful position is where I'm about to go here, which is sort of the jutting out part of the cliff, which has shots across this open crossing. It has a nice big slope in it, so I can potentially hold down off of it, and although it's not arty covered at all, I can move around enough to make it a pain to hit me. It's also more screened from the left side than I would be if I was down around the rock. Now, all my Christmases have come early here as an IS-8 tries to cross this gap. Normally this is the kind of thing a medium tank would do, and I would be lucky to get more than one shot into it. However, because an IS-8 is crossing and he's not a medium tank, not only am I able to get shots into him and track him, but he actually gets fucked up by our team. It's not really somewhere I would have taken my IS-8, certainly not with a medium guarding the gap. Unfortunately, I then embarrassed myself with that shot. The enemy M103 has the middle 120mm gun, or rather the middle gun, the lower end 120. He also doesn't really have a lot of brain power apparently, because he's trying to engage a hull down 4202 on a corner slope, which is not a good idea. Being a much more nimble tank, and also significantly smaller with harder to hit cupola, he's going to have a lot of trouble getting any kind of damage into me while I quite happily dance around the corner and put shots into him every now and then. So in that case, he is able to get a shot in, and in fact he's getting some help from the Pershing, who is riding up the slope behind me to get shots into my back. Fortunately, my teammates start pushing in a bit, which keeps the Pershing at bay long enough for me to put more damage out, in that case into a rock. You may have noticed the game stuttered just the tiniest bit as I fired. That generally is the reason I miss in these close range engagements. Either my internet connection mislays a couple of packets on their way to North America, or my game just decides it's going to pick that moment to stutter. It's a minor annoyance, and it's usually nothing too bad, but it does on occasion cost me my tank. In this situation, the 103 gets cleaned up by a teammate, and the enemy Waffenträger Panzer IV is asking our E3 if he likes HE shells and says he sent him 3. Well, certainly our E3 likes HE shells. He must love them, because HE does absolutely nothing to an E3. Sure enough, I love this stuff, he says. I have to wonder if the combined total of those 3 HE shells even added into the triple digits damage-wise. So I do bounce a shot there off the enemy pattern. I was quick and careless with my aim and just auto-aimed him. It must have hit the gun mantlet, but my next shot goes in. I then get eyes for the IS-7. I was hoping to push on him, but oh look, a Waffenträger E100. What a surprise. I didn't actually realize that by pushing into the position I did, I would be exposing myself to somebody hiding down in the enemy base. As you can see, I would have just popped over the ridgeline there and given him shots. I was not impressed. The Waffenträger E100, of course, is still hideously overpowered. It's physically impossible to balance this stupid thing unless they take away its autoloader. And even though it only gets 5 shots now instead of 6, it doesn't even need 5 shots to wreck most people's days. It only needs 2 or 3 in quick succession. In that case, he was able to track me and then hit me again before I could get out of there. And the enemy ISU was what actually delivered the killing blow. The Waffenträger doesn't even have to be the thing that kills you to make it bullshit, it just has to be the thing that puts the shots into you to keep you there. Now, I thought he was around G1, but having actually gone back and looked at the angle, he'd been sitting in J1. So he'd been sitting in J1 the entire length of the match, and I think I was the only thing he actually got to do significant damage to. And of course it figures that it would happen to me and not one of our puppies pushing through the valley. Of fucking course. But this is typically how things happen. Judging by his stats, he's probably decent enough to want to run XVM, but not good enough to be good, so to speak. It gets hard to tell as you get better at the game whether people are primarying you because you slipped up and made yourself an easy target, or because they have XVM and you're blue and most of your team is dark red. A lot of the time though, especially when I'm the only good player on my team, I do notice I get primaried no matter what I'm driving. If I'm a tier 7 in a tier 9 match, I still get primaried, even if there are better targets lit, and it's hard to tell sometimes if it's because I'm the easier target, which is, you know, understandable logic. You would take an easy shot sometimes over one that's less likely to hit, even if it's perhaps a lower tier tank. Or if it's because they just see me and think, oh, that's their good player, I've got to kill him so their team collapses, which is honestly more often than not exactly what happens after I die. So it can get hard to tell, but with things like the Waffenträger E100 kicking around, tanks that can basically pick out anything in the game and kill it in 10 seconds or less, it does make it that much worse. There's a huge difference between being hit once and then just being slammed over and over again. Driving in front of a Waffenträger E100, whether you realize it or not, is essentially the same thing as driving in front of 3 or 4 separate tanks and then focus firing. And of course, focus fire being something the average puppy doesn't do, it's not something you really think to account for, and so it takes a long time to adjust for that. The more traditional autoloaders, like say the 50, at this tier the 50B or the Batchat, they will lay shots into you like that, but you have more time to get away. The Waffenträger 100 is just, it hits you faster than you can react to it, and it hits you for a lot more as well. And so it takes a lot of time to adapt to something that's able to basically delete you from the game without any kind of thing you can do about it. In the position I was in, my brain is operating faster than my mouth today. I could have maybe run to the right downhill if I'd been able to get my repair kit up, but I would have then been easy bait for the IS-7. Had I tried to reverse up, I would have still been in its view and still been dead. So unfortunately I was just caught in the open. There wasn't really anything I could do about it. And that's often how you will die to those stupid things. You will be in the open. You might drive out from behind a house for a couple seconds, take a shot, and suddenly it's got you perma-tracked on the corner. I will quite happily advocate for its removal from the game until the day I die. It should never have been added in the first place. It is a complete... okay, I'm going to go on to another tangent here. The vast majority of tanks that exist in this game existed, at least on actual paper. I don't mean the back of a napkin, I mean blueprint paper, in real life. Some trees are more historical than others. For instance, nearly every single tank in the Soviet tree was actually built in steel. In fact, like the overwhelming majority, I want to say probably at least 80% of the Soviet tech tree, the whole national tech tree, was built in steel. Of the whole tech tree, I think there are only maybe a handful, 2 or 3 tanks that were sort of napkin designs, as it were, but the thing is, even with the Soviet napkin designs, they were typically drawn up on, proper blueprint paper by somebody with at least some kind of engineering background. Like the MT-25, for instance, was a fully designed tank. It could have been built, it just wasn't. And then things like the A-43 and A-44 mock-ups were built. So pretty much everything in the Soviet tech tree made it at least to that kind of stage. Some of the other national trees, you've got the British, they've got the 215B Heavy, which was completely a wargaming invention, the 183 Tank Destroyer, which was a mock-up, the 4202, which was built in steel. The Americans have, again, one of the more historical tech trees. Pretty much everything on the American tree was built in steel at some point, and the vast majority of them, I think, saw service in some way or another. Remember, the M6 technically did see service, it just never saw combat. And then we go to the German tree. Now, the German tree, for all the fucking complaining Veraburs do about, oh, the Soviets get all these paper tanks that never existed, blah blah blah. The German tree is the least historical tree in the game as far as I'm aware. Even the French tree is more historical, and the French tree had a lot of stuff to pad it out. In fact, actually no, I think the French tree, even most of the stuff on it currently was built in steel. So yeah, the Germans are uniquely bullshit, basically. A lot of the tanks in the German tree were never actually even fully designed. They were basically just concepts drawn in the back of a book somewhere. The E50M actually recently was patented by Wargaming, since it was designed entirely by them based on the vague notion that the Germans might have considered at some point putting a rear transmission in the E-series tanks. It was never actually designed by the Germans. Similarly, the Waffenträger E100, never designed by the Germans, never even concepted by the Germans. It was a concept entirely designed by Wargaming. The JPE100 was again a completely Wargaming design, but it was based on something the Germans had thought about doing. They just thought about doing it and never actually done it, and so obviously no real drawings existed, just vague concept sketches. Like, when I say vague concept sketches, I mean basically sort of a vaguely tank-shaped thing showing what their idea was. I don't mean like a fully fledged drawing of what they wanted it to look like. But the Waffenträger E100 is unique in the game, along with the... Well, actually, no, it is just unique in the game, because even the FV215B and the Conqueror GC were based on existing components and, at least some idea that may have been concepted. But the Waffenträger E100 was just completely invented by Wargaming to put a tier 10 on the Waffenträger line. Honestly, they should have just given the same gun without an autoloader to an E50 chassis or something. That would have been an excellent tier 10, which I'd happily play the shit out of, and it would be more in line with the other tanks in the tree. Instead, they made a fucking autoloading monstrosity, mating an anti-aircraft gun, an experimental anti-aircraft gun at that, with an E100 chassis and a very heavily modified E100 chassis. Now, you may or may not know the E100 was built in steel, and I say that with some qualifiers. The E100 hull was built in steel, kind of. The armor plating was put together, the tracks were made. It was not actually completed, though. The British captured it incomplete and basically scrapped it after taking a couple of selfies standing around inside its massive turret ring and stuff like that. So it was never fully built in steel, but it at least existed. As far as I'm aware, the turret was never even built. So, yeah, of all the trees in the game, the German tree is actually the one that's the least historical and has the most completely made-up bullshit in it. Not just that, but a lot of the upgrades in the German tree and a lot of that stuff is very heavily embellished, shall we say, based on vague ideas that the Germans, say, wanted to put the 88mm gun in the Panther, or vague ideas that they wanted to put the 105 in the Tiger, which they never actually did and put into service. I think there may have been experimental versions, but for instance with the the Tiger II mounting the 105mm gun, they had to put a second loader in, and how you would fit a second loader in the Tiger II turret is beyond me, so it would have taken a probably complete redesign to do. Which is funny because War Thunder then went and added the Panther II and the Tiger II with the 105, so much for that game being historical as well. A lot of the German tech tree stuff is just pure fantasy. Unfortunately, this is the way things tend to go with World War II Germany in any kind of game. They just get a lot of shit that never existed, probably never would have added to them, because the Germans had a lot of crazy ideas, but they never actually got around to building them, partially because Albert Speer, at least, was somewhat sane. And unfortunately as well, you get a lot of leakage, so if you ever become interested in a lot of the historical equipment used by the Wehrmacht and its various branches during World War II, you get a lot of bullshit where it's basically impossible to tell actual, LSD-fueled designs that came out of places like Blom and Voss, or the deranged mind of Kurt Tank. It becomes difficult to tell them apart from basically shit that modelers and, shall we say, Wehrabus and their worst cousins, Nazi Germany like actual fetishists, who constantly theorize about what if this and that. It's hard to tell them apart, because a lot of the stuff the Germans did design late war, or at least concept, was legitimately fucking insane. If you want to have a real good laugh, look at some of their very, very, very late war jet aircraft designs. I don't mean the ones that were built, I mean the ones that were just basically sketched and never actually fully engineered. So it does get very hard to tell it apart, and it's more so than with any other nation, because other nations' experimental designs tend to be cast into the dustbin of history, whereas because people have this bizarre obsession with Nazi Germany, a lot of the time I find it tends to be a little bit politically motivated. They tend to blur the lines and invent their own whack shit and then try and pass it off as the real thing. There's a lot of websites out there which basically, shall we say, take actual German experimental designs and then add to them and improve upon them and pass them off as if it's the real historical design and not something they have messed with. And it's a huge problem. It makes it fucking nightmare to research anything the Germans ever designed, and it ends up leaking all over the place. It's really not a good thing. If you want to do some sort of weirdo fucking alt history autism shit, like, please note it as such. Don't try and pass it off like it's a real thing. Like, I get that people want to be believable in all this shit, but there's so much fucking Nazi Germany alternate history bullshit that it's a nightmare. It's a fucking academic minefield, and that's not a good thing. Not at all a good thing, because it really fucks with people's ability to learn history. Anyway, having gone on my little rant about history and people with strange hobbies, thanks for watching. Thanks for putting up with my oftentimes completely irrelevant rambling at the end of matches. I would like to have something more interesting going on in the background visually while I talk, but obviously as somebody who lacks any kind of fancy editing software and who also lacks any kind of motivation to do anything fancy, you're just basically going to have to deal with it. Thanks for stopping by. Wish you the best of luck in the field as ever, and I will see you next time.